Hello, hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question: what is good garbage? Hello, hello. Today we have the pleasure to speak with Ho Ren Hua, the CEO of Hua, a leading company in the agri-product space, now working on creating bioplastic solutions from tapioca starch. Ren comes from a deep and impressive family legacy. His grandparents started the business over 75 years back. We explore the plans for Hua and try to get an understanding of the intricacies of tapioca in this conversation. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Ren and I met at Rethinking Materials, which was a conference in London, and I was immediately taken by the man's mission and his speed. So it's been so impressive to be friends with you, Ren, and to be in conversation, to see how fast you move in terms of business speed, but also how focused you are towards sustainability. And it'll be great to learn more today from you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this podcast and this movement.
Great, nice to see you again, and thanks so much for having me on board today.
So we were doing our research, and I know you, but what was really impressive was your family background. So I actually want to dig in and start there because you come from such a strong lineage, and I was especially impressed with your grandfather and grandmother on your paternal side. But your grandfather was an ambassador of Singapore to Thailand, and that is an interesting idea as well. And of course, then he ended up forming Taiwan. And your grandmother herself, and we're talking about 40s here, and she was a chemist and was educated abroad. And so I actually want to start there and learn more about them as much as you can sort of tell us, and that'll give us an idea into your mind. And of course, I'll move to your parents after that.
So, as a company, we just celebrated our 75th anniversary just a couple of weeks ago. So, it was an incredible milestone for the company that my grandparents founded back in 1947 in Bangkok. So, if we go back 7 decades, I think the idea of being pioneers in agriculture and food technology was relatively new. My grandparents, we originate from Singapore. Ethnically, the lineage, for 100 years ago came from China. But my grandparents, my grandfather grew up in Singapore. My grandmother grew up in China. And they met in the US in the 1940s. And they then started pioneering Taiwan as an agriculture company shortly after World War II. My grandfather's background was in agriculture economics. So he was always very interested and keen around agriculture, economic development, and thinking more broadly, how do we, leverage, economic and business platforms for social good. And again, the context of Southeast Asia in 1940s and 50s, I mean, agriculture was just about starting, right? You think about rice and tapioca and pulses and all that. It's very, very new in that regard. So that was his DNA, and that was an inclination around agriculture economics, which he studied. My grandma was fascinating. She was really like left brain, right brain. She was a trained chemist, but she had a love for literature. So, besides her career in Taiwan, is essentially our first chief chemist or chief science officer in terms of pioneering new technologies and setting up a lab and looking at processing. She was really a very strong literary figure at heart. So she published a lot in Singapore in terms of her books and journals. She wrote a bilingual column in English and Chinese in Singapore, I think for over 20 years. So over the course of their career, I think in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I think they always had this duality about, building business, but there's a broader appreciation for things that they're passionate about. So for my grandfather, it was really around agriculture economics. For my grandmother, it was around this balance between, chemistry and literature. So I think the game-changing moment or defining, the trajectory of the company over decades was really after World War II, specifically 1947, when they decided that agriculture and agriculture development and food technology was going to be a very, very important part of Southeast Asia. And then that's how Taiwan took off. Over the 50s and 60s and 70s, we grew sustainably. to become a pioneer in tapioca starch, tapioca chips, food technology, food processing, until where we are today. Over the last 75 years, it's been an incredible journey. When we had our company milestone just barely 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the team that worked with my grandparents in 1950s and 1960s. So we called them the pioneers of Taiwan. Some of our leaders who had dedicated 20, 30, 40 years of their lives to the company. And it's an incredible milestone. And, going back to the core of agriculture and sustainability, it's really, really a long-term business. My grandmother passed away a bit over 10 years ago, and she never knew that I would join Taiwan. So back then I was still in the US. I started my career in the US, and obviously, very close to my grandmother for the last 20 years. But she never knew that I would join Taiwan, which I only joined in 2015, 4 years after she passed away. So it's a beautiful, homecoming, when we think about the legacy and the history of it. And ultimately, I think, what motivates us, what inspires is really the founding vision to really be, a special company, to really be a long-term company.
Yeah, and then your father comes along, and again, it's an interesting insight into the way your grandparents functioned, because what I read is your father becomes a journalist, and that's where he starts, and then doesn't just join Taiwan, creates this another beautiful set of companies, the Banyan Tree. So that's also interesting, and it shows a lot about how independent thinking your grandparents were.
That the family's philosophy and ethos around sustainability, from my grandparents to my parents and me and Ren Yong, my sister, I think started with simple values around doing good business, being responsible. And again, it some ways is contextual because, as I mentioned, tourism and food are by definition long-term businesses which provide social impact in terms of jobs and services, and there's clearly a social impact to that. So I think the orientation of the family's values around what does it mean to be a good business, what does it mean to be a sustainable business. We got to grow, but we don't grow too fast. We got to treat people right. That really came out through family conversations, family values, family behaviors over many years, and these things kind of transmit over time. My parents had a different journey. My parents spent a lot of time in Hong Kong in the initial years before I was born. That really triggered the inspiration for Banyan Tree in terms of what Banyan Tree stands for, and the concept and the roots and the Asianness and the heritage of Banyan Tree as a leading luxury hospitality brand. So the Hong Kong time that my parents spent when they were a young couple, and developing their own notions and thesis around what is sustainable tourism, how do we think about well-being, how do we think about designing and developing a meaningful brand. I think that was really very much in their time and space, back in the 70s and 80s. In the 80s and 90s, I was born in Singapore in 82. A lot of the company's foundations for Banyan Tree and Taiwan then took shape in Thailand. So Taiwan was based in Thailand because that's where the home of tapioca is, the heart of tapioca is. But over the 80s and 90s, both businesses, Banyan Tree and Taiwan, really started strengthening the foundations and building the business in Thailand over the 80s and 90s. And then fast forward subsequently, Taiwan, then one part of Taiwan was listed on the Thai Stock Exchange in the late 80s. And then Banyan Tree was listed in Singapore in the early 2000s. So between Taiwan and Banyan Tree, I think there's always a parallel development. I think both are very long-term businesses. Tourism and food and agriculture are clearly businesses and social goods that we need for the next hundreds and hundreds of years. So we're very excited. We're very excited. We're very grateful that we have the opportunity to participate in these businesses. And right now, I think we're at an inflection point where for both businesses, we're looking to scale in our own way and scale in a very sustainable and meaningful way.
Yeah, it's so beautiful to hear that. And to sustain that idea over 75 years is a long, long period. And it's clearly in your genes to sort of be able to do that. And you've, of course, taken it forward. And that takes me to your journey, and which is also a really spectacular, interesting one, because you didn't start with your family business. And in passing, you mentioned that. And so it'll be good to hear about your journey and how you got convinced that you want to come back to the family business and start building that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I've just started my journey, so I tell myself it's a long journey. I just turned 40, so it's been a great life milestone in terms of just a father of two kids. Rocket's 7 and Sonnet is 4. So my life journey, I think, very much has probably been split into, I guess, two main kind of chunks, and I use kind of the broader context of life journey, and then you embed business and leadership there. The first half of it was obviously growing up in Singapore. And growing up in Singapore, I think it provides you a very unique perspective on the world. This is Singapore back in the 80s and 90s, and noticing from afar, at least going for trips and holidays and business trips, how Taiwan and Bantry were developing. So I always had a very close relationship to understand more about the values and ethos of the business back in the 1990s from a Singapore context. So that was fascinating for me. I think growing up in Singapore in the 80s and 90s really gave me a very unique perspective around just having to think outside your own box and having to actually understand different cultures, different realities, and putting things together. Subsequently after that, I guess the last 10 years before Taiwan, I joined Taiwan 6 years ago, but before Taiwan, I guess most of my time was split between China and the US. So I went to school in the US, started my career in New York, and then subsequently spent 6 years in China before coming back to Taiwan. And that again was a fascinating time. That was very much around an orientation around professional business, leadership, strategy, both at Wharton and both at Bain. And I think the takeaway for me there was just really the understanding of working across borders. So, from my first job in New York City to then, working for Bantry in Shanghai and then subsequently moving. I think just the experience and the empathy and the curiosity to just work across borders, to me is really, really fascinating. And even today, as we build Taiwan globally, when we talk to customers and partners and investors in the US or in China and India, I think that background to actually, work across different markets and really learn to adapt and listen and to lead across different teams, that's really exciting. And that's been an incredible experience and one that I'm, very, very grateful for. And then finally, drawing back to the Taiwan experience, which coincided with my life experience by becoming a dad. My son Rocket was born 7 years ago, which is when I pretty much came on Taiwan as the CEO. What happened then was we had we basically IPO'd the company because we amalgamated two smaller entities into one larger listed holding company called Taiwan Group, Taiwan Public Company. And that was really my first time, CEO experience as an inexperienced, young, probably quite brash 33-year-old in Thailand. And again, that's been an incredible journey. I think the 7-year journey of being a CEO has taught me so much around leadership, around strategy, around impact. And at the same time, is parallel to the life journey of being a dad. So my CEO tenure, 7 years as Taiwan CEO, is very much linked to my fatherhood, and my son is now 7 years old. So that's where we are, man. I think it's been incredibly exciting. I guess the two big parts of my own life journey has been half of it, just growing up in Singapore and being very exposed and learning to think outside borders in a much more global context. And the second half of it has just really been, incredibly fun and exciting to just build teams and scale businesses in various locations, whether it's New York or Shanghai or Bangkok.
Oh, that's incredible. And I'm going to pivot and move into the main part of the conversation, which is, of course, something that it feels like you've brought into Taiwan, the idea of using tapioca as a renewable packaging material. So I would love to learn more about that idea. How did it emerge? What inspired you? And then how have you built it?
I think, that the foray into bioplastics and the new platform of developing a strategy and executing on bioplastics is probably part of a broader vision of the group around what we call our core motto and our reason our reason for being is really that innovation and sustainability from farm to shelf. So if you look at Taiwan today, we're pretty much integrated as a plant-based agriculture platform across Southeast Asia. So our sustainability framework and ethos is the four main F's, right? Farm, family, factory, and food. So we work very closely with tapioca farmers in terms of processing ingredients. We develop finished products. We export across many different categories, both B2C and B2B. So that's the starting point. The starting point is that we are fundamentally an agriculture company in creating long-term value from farm to shelf, and we really believe in sustainability and innovation. So the DNA of the company is very much around that value chain, right? Working with farmers, raw material, processing it, developing, exporting, distributing. Bioplastic specifically, I guess, probably arose around 3-4 years ago. It's clearly part of the much more of a global trend and global movement towards sustainable packaging, biodegradability, compostability. We really started this probably about 3 years ago, just tinkering around and understanding from a product point of view, what is unique about tapioca-based bioplastics. So you've got different types of thermoplastics. You've got corn-based, potato-based. You got many types of biopolymer compounds. You can compound into different things and flexible and injection. So there's a whole range of different things that one can apply plant-based bioplastics to. So I think it's probably around 3 years ago, before COVID, that we started to notice that, hey, there's a good idea here, and let's spend about a year, putting together the thoughts and the teams and ideas around, really being a pioneer in tapioca-based bioplastics. And particularly through COVID, that really resonated. When the world was essentially shut down for 24 months, we just continued on the research and development. So we continued to understand the processes of extrusion. We continue to understand how do we blow our own film. We continue to understand about different types of biodegradable standards, and we just continue on the journey of through COVID of really understanding what does it take to start a new platform around biodegradability and tapioca-based bioplastics. Today we're operating at scale. By end of the year, we'll probably be about close to a capacity of about 2,000, 3,000 tons of tapioca-based bioplastics. We're going to triple that next year. So the momentum and the work over the last 3 years has really been very, very exciting. So the broader story, as I said, the starting point is really the bioplastics is an extension of the company's DNA to really drive change and innovation from farm to shelf.
Want to be a part of the next big thing in the compostable packaging space? Check out gcahub.com, gcahub.com. Create your free account and connect with others in the sustainable packaging industry. On GCA Hub, you can exchange ideas, network, solutions, problems, and learn through curated resources. Let's connect for impact. Now, let's get back to the conversation. So you mentioned this in passing in terms of tapioca, and it'll be great to learn more about how tapioca differs from, like you mentioned, the starch from corn, the starch from potatoes. I presume they have different properties, and you clearly feel that, the starch from tapioca is different. And so it'll be great to understand how it differs and how do you see that as an advantage?
I think there are two main aspects to that. The first would be functionally speaking, right? So again, any kind of starch-based compound or plant-based compounds generally doesn't stand alone. It blends, with other polymers and so on and so forth. So tapioca, just based on the structure, even when used for food or for industrial or for packaging, has a different functional characteristic, which is quite different from corn. And depending on the application, whether it's around smell, it's around texture, it's around molecular density, there are functional characteristics that are different. So that's the first part of it. That all plants are similar but different. So essentially, tapioca is one of the crops in Southeast Asia, and then it's really a question of what type of application are you going for, and then how do you cater and customize those applications. The second point then actually I think is an increasingly more important point in today's world, and that's around the structure of agriculture and regional supply chains. So you don't really have much corn and wheat grown in Southeast Asia, right? It's very corn and potato and wheat are very much in the northern hemisphere, in China and the US and Europe. But tapioca is very much uniquely found in Southeast Asia, in big parts of Africa, in big parts of Brazil. So the regional supply chain of being able to source, raw materials and create raw materials in a circular fashion, that's incredibly important right now. And we've seen that particularly this year, with the war going on in Europe and with the energy crisis and with COVID, that the importance of regional supply chains around agriculture and agriculture innovation is going to be very, very important. So while we, develop products which I'll say are, similar but different in a way to other types of starches from all over the world, the fact that we're building a platform here out of Southeast Asia that will cater very quickly to our customers in India. We've got 3 or 4 major customers talking about it in India, in Indonesia, in China, in Japan, and Korea. I think that's going to be a very important part of this journey going forward. So 2 aspects really, right? One is around the functional characteristics. And the second one will be more around the idea of, regional supply chains and regional proximity.
Yeah, you took the Thai saying, same, but different.
Same, but different, yeah.
But I want to dig deeper into the functional because a lot of the listeners that listen to our podcast are in the sustainable packaging space, and it's always good to dig a little deeper on the technical side because two aspects now. How does the starch primarily differ on the technical aspects in terms of structure? And then you talked about blending. And what is that blend, and how does that differ from other starches, if it does? Maybe it doesn't, and that's fine. So it'll be interesting to know both those aspects.
So first of all, the structural profile, right? So the amylose, amylopectin, and the molecular structure of tapioca and corn and potato, that differs. So once that differs, once you blow it into different applications, whether it's flexibles, injection, you probably have slightly different types of tensile strength, elongation. Tapioca based part is not that, it's okay for thermoforming and injection molding, but less applicable for rigid. Because you can imagine for rigid, because plants are generally quite soft and malleable, right? But for rigid packaging, you probably need, slightly more sturdy applications. So that's one aspect of it, understanding from the starch, and not just the starch, but starch modification, how that lends itself into applications. In terms of working with the whole suite of, other biopolymers and PRA and PBAT and PHA, I think what we're doing right now is to really go a bit deeper into understanding the starch modification as well. So as I mentioned, once you look into the structure of it and you look into the mixing of it, working with different types of, tapioca starch, and we also do modified starches, working on the proportion of blends. So a certain amount you do with PLA and PBAT and PHA, that becomes a very key consideration. And then finally, the point would be around cost, because I think in this industry around sustainable packaging and eco packaging, cost is very important. And we are competitive because we get the raw material, we are vertically integrated in terms of our business model. So the cost equation is also a very important part to actually developing viability for new solutions for our customers. So today we're looking at different types of tapioca-based products, different types of tapioca-based compounds. And further down the line, probably over the next 1 or 2 years, we'll look even more into further innovation around plant-based. So it could be types of fibers, right? You can use fibers to fortify, to strengthen certain applications. It will be certain byproducts that we can use, our tapioca pulp, to bring back circularity into the process. So I think, tapioca is just a start, and our strength is really using tapioca as a foundation and using tapioca as a platform. But further along the way, we'll probably work around experiment with other, plant-based fibers and other raw materials or biomaterials in this part of the world. So our niche is really meant to be, functionally effective, but also cost competitive at that bar, $1, $2, or $3 a kilo.
That's incredible because I feel that that's the only way you can scale significantly. So of course, I find at least the costs that you're mentioning are pretty competitive even with traditional polymers like polyethylene. It'll be great to hear your view on that. And if you compare, say, a thin film, which will probably be a big application for you, in comparison to a polyethylene film, how do you stand in terms of performance?
Well, so a lot of the traditional polyethylene, PPP, I mean, again, it kind of fluctuates with raw material prices. So that's one important point, right? Ours, as agriculture, they tend to fluctuate, but they generally are a bit more even in that sense. So if you look at the cost of the tapioca starch and the variability of the tapioca starch, in general, over a period of time, you're looking at about less than half of a dollar. So that's a very important point. So the fluctuation of the raw material of tapioca and tapioca starch compared to P and PP, which can go up and down mainly because of geopolitical, over a period of time is generally less than, let's say, half a dollar a kilo. Then you go do all the processing. So that's the first point about, consistency of cost over a period of time. In terms of films, it comes down to thinness of film. So obviously PPP can be quite superior for very thin films. What we're trying to do is to really find that sweet spot for, different micron levels. So 20, 30, 50, so on and so forth, for large scale applications. So we're launching a new project on biofilms, which is very exciting, right? So biofilms to basically protect, kind of the ground to increase, the moisture content. We're looking at different types of bags and liners. We're looking at different types of shrink film and wraps. So the micron level, in terms of the thinness and the elongation, that also becomes a critical point. But it still ties back to finding that balance around cost-effective solution. So the percentage use for tapioca is also important, right? It could range from 20 to 40 to 60, again, depending on what you're trying to blow and what you're trying to create. And I think that versatility is going to be very important going forward, because as customers think about their own solutions, if you ask 4 different retailers, they're probably going to give you 4 slightly different responses about different micro levels, and 4 slightly different responses about translucency, and 4 slightly different responses about how much tensile. So I think that versatility is something that we want to do. And I would say right now it's probably ranging from a drop in of 30% to 70-80%. I think it's not going to be easy to get to price parity, right? I don't think the goal is to get a price parity, because you're talking about mass, right? You're talking about the whole world that has been conditioned to PEPP, and talking about millions and millions of tons. So purely from a business model perspective, to even get to price parity, I think that will be very hard if you adjust for all the different specifications. I think right now we are at a point where which we are much closer to getting to price competitiveness. So while the more expensive stuff, they are probably at least double or triple the cost, we're probably like anywhere from, let's say, 30 to 50 to 60% closer. So price parity is going to be essentially hard to get to, and that's not really the goal, right? Because if you think about this broader theme around sustainability and biopackaging and just reducing waste and increasing bio content, all of us are competing against PEP resin, where there are millions and millions of tons, and a lot of the chemicals produced are putting a very cheap level. I think the question is more around how do we customize it at a cost effectiveness which is probably, I would say, less than double. And for us, we're clearly there. So for a lot of the different applications, what we're trying to do, it could range from, let's say, 30, 50, 70% more than a conventional solution. That's one part. And then the other part, obviously, like all things, is a sustainability premium, right? So when you talk to customer, depending on the customer, whether it's a retailer or it's an end user, it's a farmer, the sustainability premium of why they want to use it, how they're going to try it, to test out that it's compostable, biodegradable, that becomes an important part of the conversation. So the sustainability premium will always be there. If not, generally they'll gravitate to PPP. So it's our job to really see how we can drive that, to test that, to pilot that, and over a period of time, I think, see how we can increase the conversion and drive that kind of change.
Super impressive. And you mentioned different applications in passing. It'll be great to elaborate on how do you see the main applications that you are targeting, and what would be the primary focus, and then what would be the other applications that you would channelize towards.
I think in the next 1-2 years, flexible films, that would clearly be the focus, just as I mentioned, the DNA and the structure of our product. So different types of flexible packaging, films, thin films, garbage films, liners, agriculture mulch films, wraps. So I would say flexible films are definitely the focus. In terms of thermoforming, injection molding, that again comes down quite specific to how you blend it with other things. And from a retailer perspective, that also has different price considerations. So I'll say the first phase for the next 1-2 years, very much around the flexible film space, a lot around agriculture, in fact. So we're spending quite a lot of time developing new biofilms and testing that out in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, and even in Indonesia, to really look at different types of films, because these biofilms do have a very strong productivity and sustainability angle. In regards to the more rigid packaging, like different aspects of let's say thermoforming or injection molding, I think that would also have to work with the market and how things evolved, right? So when we look at across the world, across the markets that we operate in, thinking towards 2025 or 2030, the pace of regulation and policy around reducing single-use plastics, increasing bio content, more bio blends, that happens to be quite uneven, right? So Europe is doing certain things, China is doing certain things, India is doing certain things, Thailand is doing certain. That tends to be uneven. So what we have to do then basically is see how we can keep up with the market, right? So based on as markets move towards different equilibriums, how do we develop solutions which cater to those market evolutions? And they're probably gonna evolve in a relatively uneven way, right? Europe evolves in a certain way, and China in a certain way, and US in a certain way. But fundamentally, that this is a 20, 30 year, 50 year endeavor, right? In this movement to fundamentally reduce plastic waste, increase biodegradability and bio content. So if we take going back to my grandparents' time, we take a 50-year view on this, we've hardly scratched the surface.
And that's great to have that lineage where you think 50 years ahead and not just the next quarter that you have to report. So that's the difference, big difference in a company like yours. So looking at flexible packaging as such, are you also looking at multi-layered kind of substrates where there is a strong focus on WVTR, OTR kind of properties and snack bags?
Yeah, from a customer and market perspective, I think multi-layer would definitely be interesting. But again, that you would have to blend it and even coat it, right? With certain things to kind of give it that layer. So we are actually experimenting with certain things where we use our tapioca-based compounds, and it could be different types of nano coating or film coating to develop that multi-layered effectiveness, right? Particularly around oxygen barrier, moisture barrier. So that's still in the works. I think that will probably in the next 1-2 years unfold. But going forward, I think as we think about this market, I think you're right that multi-layer packaging will definitely be an important part because the consumer wants it, right? The consumer wants it depending on what kind of product they're bringing home and they're eating or they're using in school and in restaurants and stuff. So multi-layer packaging is definitely going to be interesting. Again, there are innovations in the market from a cost perspective around filming, coating, barriers, and we're just starting to explore that process.
That's wonderful because that's definitely a huge problem and a huge challenge as well as a huge opportunity. If you did not have any barriers at all, Ren, and if you look at the next 5 years, what is the max scale that you see that you can take? How much tapioca will be available for starch production? And what is the kind of tonnage? You're already doing a significant tonnage, but as you and I both know, and you mentioned it again, is that it's the problem is millions and billions of tons. So what is the kind of scale that you can achieve if there are absolutely no barriers? Considering the feed that you can get, what is the maximum in the next 5 years?
The challenge we face is more about time as opposed to fundamental business barriers. So in a certain period of time, I think we could convert our entire business to a bioplastic business, right? But as I said, there are two aspects to it, right? One is consumer price conversion. Will they pay 50% more for this based on sustainability premium? It's compostable, it's biodegradable, and regulatory policy evolution around ban of single use, increasing biocontent, which uneven on the world. So I think the type of scale we are operating in there, I think within linearly, within let's say about now, I think within 10 years, 15 years, we could convert the entire business into a bio because it's just bioplastics is less than I think 1.5% or less than 2% of the total plastics waste issue. So the scale of which and the opportunity of which I think we can easily grow 10 times in the next 5 to 10 years. I think the deeper question is just for us is just being thoughtful and being prudent and being wise around understanding that these things take time, and specifically around the two areas around consumer price, the price mix, and around regulatory policy. What we do think though, personally, what I do think is that as we think about the global scale now, how things are moving towards a general disposition towards carbon net zero and climate change and plastic waste, I think things are clearly accelerating a lot more now than 3-4 years ago. Of course, as a global community, everyone say we can't do enough, we need to do enough. But I do think there's a lot more acceleration than 3 years ago. So it's very human for us to say we're not doing enough, but we're doing a lot more than 3 years ago. Like when you and I met, like 4 or 5 months ago to now, I think things are already moving. Personally, I do think that from 2025 to 2030, there will be an acceleration. Different governments, again, quite uneven in terms of regulatory policy around plastics and reuse. But I think that many governments are focused on, let's say, that 2025 goal. Okay, we're going to do this by 2025, so on and so forth. And then the business community kind of like adapts to reaching that 2025. Personally, I'm quite optimistic that from 2025 to 2030, as we get closer to these broader, net zero targets and decarbonization targets and reduce waste, I think there'll be an acceleration. So to answer your question, I think it's not linear as the next 5 years. I think there's tremendous scale that we can easily grow 10x in 10 years or even 20x. I think in the next 2 or 3 years is to be very prudent and business savvy around price mix. And I do think really that from 2025 to 2030, based on an acceleration of awareness and consumer adoption and policy, we will see the curve rapidly ramp up.
That's wonderful to hear. And the other thing which has been super impressive for me to read about, one is that, like you've got many awards, but one of it is outstanding sustainability performance. The other one, which clearly runs through the basic DNA, is the idea of customer experience, which is mentioned many places from your father to you. And, the third is, of course, team and, the way you are building the team and how you sort of work with that. The fourth, and I'm piling on the questions, so don't worry about it. We can hack into it whichever way you want. So the fourth is, this whole your own global expertise. Having studied in U.S., grown up in Singapore, spent time in China, based in Thailand. You guys have already launched in Indonesia, and again, the other, maybe the last part is that equality. Like I read things like gender equality, which is also really impressive, and I can see that coming right from your grandma onwards. You have such strong women influences. So I know I've piled on the questions. You can hack at it however you want it, and I can bring back the things which we miss out.
Great. You're an incredible interviewer, by the way, because you make me think and I can't stop thinking. So I gotta work hard for my. I gotta work hard for this podcast because you're an incredible interviewer. Again, I take a step back in a more personal and a more intimate way. I think the role of parents are very important in everything we do, regardless of who we are, where we come from. I think the role of parents and the privilege of just being a parent in today's world is incredibly important. I'm very grateful to my grandparents. I'm very grateful to my parents for providing a rich color around life and business and leadership that we can be ambitious, but we always have to be down to earth. We have to grow, but we don't have to grow too fast. We have to treat people right. So I think ultimately that the deeper part of me is just an awareness that being a good parent and the role of parenting, not just in business or forget the title, it's just important to everyone, regardless of who you are, where you come from. Just being a parent and being a good parent to nurture our kids, over the next decades. The second thing I think has changed in me, frankly, perhaps compared to let's say 5 years or 10 years ago, is to really, really conceptualize that 20, 30 year goal. So, when I started my career in the US, 10 years ago, and then in China 5 years ago, again, we lived in a very different world, right? I mean, we've been through a hyper growth, turbocharged, digital first world over the last 15 years. Everyone was turbocharging, right? But now I think the constraints, the considerations, the challenges are much more real, much more fundamental. So I think, what I've changed, where I've evolved in, both my own personal views and my own leadership styles and my own, true convictions is to really, really think, 20, 30, 40 years ahead, but still be very active and very ambitious about, okay, what do we need to do over the next 2 or 3 years? For me, fundamentally, I think for Taiwan and to some extension Tree, I think the environment is incredibly important. So physical environment. So all the, just having a path towards making a small dent in decarbonization is really, really important. And, as we sit here today, that, 30 years from now, 2050 or so, my daughter will just be like 34 years old. So, even if we can make a dent, mini, but significant dent towards decarbonization, I think that's something that I'll be incredibly proud of. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is just very simply just, being a good company. As a company today across both Taiwan and Tree, we employ, probably on Tree, I think about 12,000, on Taiwan about close to 4,000. We've got great dreams, but we don't believe in hubris. We don't believe in grandeur. We believe just by being a responsible, creative, purposeful company, providing jobs, creating employment for the people we work with, that's what motivates me at the end of the day. So, I think at the end of the day, it's really about what really, really motivates you. And for me, I think the two things that I would think in our businesses around tourism and food over the next 20, 30 years would be around the physical environment with a very profound lens around decarbonization and making that dent in our own way. And second of all, just being a good company.
So we always want to know, what does the idea of good garbage mean to you? And you can take it as you want. How would you kind of define it? But it'll be lovely to get your thoughts on that subject.
Yeah, thank you, Van. I think that was a very meaningful and thoughtful question. For us, good garbage, I would kind of twist it a bit of a spin. It's kind of like what we're trying to do, and we're trying to make it good to great. Specifically in agriculture, and in the theme of agriculture waste, agricultural residue, and upcycling. There's a lot of good stuff going right now, right? So people are looking at different byproducts of agriculture. They're looking at waste to value has been around. So that's really starting to take form. Obviously, there are many different pathways in terms of how we think about waste upcycling, how we think about driving change in terms of new methods to new byproducts, agriculture residues. So that's kind of the good upcycling and waste upcycling that's going on right now in our industry, in our space. To me, just to add a bit more of a twist to it, what great garbage looks like in a very simple but profound way is returning back to Mother Earth, specifically the soil. One of the biggest themes, I think, in agriculture over the next 20, 30 years is around the nature of soil health, soil conditioning, soil improvement, and creating circularity around soil health. So whether that for us is, good upcycling of taking agricultural pulp and then making it into a biofertilizer, whether it's about launching, different types of agricultural films to actually preserve the moisture content, whether it's around, new digital technologies to help farmer. I think the soil, is something is really the heart of Mother Earth. I mean, it's been neglected for quite a long time. There's a lot more awareness now about, returning, restoration to the soil. So I think, for us, good garbage is in some ways the way we think about it is just about upcycling and reducing waste. For me, great garbage, so to speak, is really that it's so great. I mean, it's just not garbage, but ultimately the soil and Mother Earth is something that was really, really precious to all of us.
Thank you, Ren. I know you are running around the globe building your business, and you've taken this time out. It's precious for me, and I'm sure it'll be precious for those who listen to your ideas and thoughts and how you're building Taiwa. Thank you for doing the incredible work that you're doing, and thank you for steering the company also towards sustainable packaging. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for sharing your incredible ideas.
No, thank you so much, Ven, to you and your team. It's a pleasure to spend time on the podcast. Great to see you in London, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Good Garbage Podcast. Follow us on social media to never miss an episode. Links are in the description below. I'm your host, Ved Krishna. See you next time.